Alright guys, video 2 on probabilities and research. In this one, I really want to talk about some of the cautions with sampling and drawing conclusions. We highlighted some of that before when we talked about different types of sampling methods and ensuring that the sample is representative of that larger population. But now I want to talk about some particular biases that can arise, sometimes even within ourselves, that can lead to an issue with the way we look at our own data. And so we need to be careful which conclusions we jump to, right? So the first one I want to discuss is something called the confirmation bias. And I'll put a video at the end of the lecture here that describes the confirmation bias in a little bit more detail so you can really sort of see how it plays out in a number of scenarios. But in essence, it's our tendency, unintentionally, to pay attention to the evidence that fits or confirms our belief, and to ignore or forget even evidence that disconfirms our beliefs. So this could be you're an employer and you're looking to hire an individual and you feel like that person does or does not already fit what you think that employee should look like. So then you look over their resume to see whether or not they have the appropriate qualifications. And what you find is that if you feel that they are fit for the job before you looked at the resume, you tend to notice the things that are positive characteristics about them. Say they attended a particular university you think to be prestigious, or have this particular experience that you think relevant to this incoming job. But you ignore the section where they checked a box saying they have previously been incarcerated for theft from their prior employer, right? Or something like that. These things can definitely occur, and they can occur in research as well. As researchers, we go into our study with a belief about what we think will happen. We read the background literature, we've made some observations with our own eyes, and we think when you give people caffeine, they will remember more from a word list than if you give them no caffeine, right? You just give them water or a placebo. That's your belief. So when you go into that study, you're hoping the group that gets caffeine does better. Well, you don't want to walk in there and sound super enthusiastic and excited and say, hey guys, you're going to do great today because this is an easy memory study and we're just going to do, and then go to the other group and say, ha, good luck. This is not going to be an easy task. Or even just to be neutral, right? Your interaction style can change their behavior. And if your interaction style is in such a way designed, whether intentionally or not, to bring about your own results, your own beliefs, then it's a good example of another situation of confirmation bias. And so one of the ways in which we sort of avoid confirmation bias in inferential statistics and hypothesis testing is that we actually don't test our hypotheses. I might believe that caffeine affects memory. But the alternative to that is that caffeine does not affect memory, and it has no effect whatsoever. That is the hypothesis that we test. That's the one we try and find evidence for. And if we can't find any evidence that nothing is going on, then maybe something is going on. And that's essentially the way hypothesis testing works from a theoretical standpoint. That's why hypotheses need to be testable, but it also helps us to avoid some of that confirmation bias. A sort of form of confirmation bias occurs in what we call illusory correlation, where you believe an association exists between two variables when no such association exists at all, right? So a lot of our superstitions, right? A black cat crosses your path, you believe that to be a cause of bad luck, and so then you notice later on you stubbed your toe on a chair, you dropped a glass when you were getting water and it broke in the kitchen, but you don't notice that you also got an A on your test that day, or that you didn't have a headache and you had previously thought you would have a headache from whatever it was. That's a good example of seeing a relationship there and then confirmation bias strengthening the belief in that relationship, right? So the graphic here, these children have autism. These children were vaccinated. Therefore, vaccines cause autism. Well, the next graphic, these children have autism. These children have teddy bears. Oh, shit. Teddy bears cause autism. All cats have 4 legs. This animal has 4 legs. Therefore, that rhinoceros must not actually be a rhinoceros, it's a cat. Just because two things appear to be correlated does not mean they're actually related in any meaningful way, right? It could, in many cases, be an illusory correlation. So we have to, as researchers, be very careful when we read into what it means that two variables appear mathematically to be related. Are there other third variable causes that might be involved? This stuff we'll elaborate on in our discussion of correlation, but I wanted to touch on it here. One good example of this is superstition, right? As I already sort of highlighted. And my favorite example of a superstition comes from one of the best basketball players that's ever played the game, right? Yeah. You guys are probably thinking of LeBron James, but no, I'm thinking a little bit older than that. Somebody who played for a college rivalry team, actually, for me. That's Michael Jordan. So he played for the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Boo, go NC State. Anyway, he won some championships there. He was really good, right? No question. At least one of the best basketball players that has ever performed. And Chapel Hill wore these light blue jerseys, just like they still do. And when he was playing for Chapel Hill, the jerseys worn by college and NBA athletes sported these very, very short, almost tennis short, right, style shorts, and a simplistic jersey. When Michael Jordan went to the NBA, he was drafted by the Bulls. You might remember these sorts of shots, right? Massive dunks airing through the sky from what seemed like impossible distances to still make contact with that rim. But notice his shorts. So if I go back, short shorts, long shorts. Fashion changed all of a sudden as he was entering the NBA. Basketball shorts started being offered in much longer styles, not the 70s, early 80s shorter shorts that men were used to wearing. But why did this change occur? Was it just that the NBA or some outside force said, hey, long shorts sure would be fun? Actually, one of the drivers of this was Michael Jordan himself. He had a belief that those blue shorts he wore at Chapel Hill were lucky, because when he wore them, he played particularly well. In cases where he didn't wear them, so when he was just practicing with friends or things like that, he wouldn't do as well. In cases where they might wear a different set of shorts because of a different color of jersey, he didn't feel like he played as well, and so he thought those shorts were the key to his success, in addition to athletic ability and things like that. And so when he moved to the Bulls, in any important game, guess what he was wearing underneath his Bulls shorts? Those Chapel Hill shorts. Why did the Bulls shorts have to be longer? Because he was embarrassed by this and requested longer shorts for his jersey. The whole team got longer shorts, so it wouldn't just be him, and the trend sort of spread to other items of clothing, right? Other shorts that weren't just basketball shorts. And it's all because Michael Jordan had this false belief, this illusory correlation, that his shorts were the key to his success. I think you hear about athletes not changing their socks through the entire playoffs because they think they're lucky. If it helps them play better, sure, but it doesn't actually have a causal relationship here. Another thing that we have to be cautious of when we're interpreting evidence is a phenomenon called groupthink. So researchers often work in teams, right? I have 4 or 5 other individuals that I might meet with to discuss the data that we're looking at. So what do we think these data are telling us? Well, the problem with getting a group of individuals who already think alike together is that if one of them falls prey to some illusory correlation, right, some minor confirmation bias where they believe their personal belief to be true because of this evidence, then it's easy to convince those around them because they all have a similar set of opinions. And then when a whole group of them all think they see that one thing, you're much more likely to act on that even when the evidence itself might be weak, sometimes at best. Right? You might not remember the justification for going into the Middle East and particularly Iraq many years ago, but it was for weapons of mass destruction. Following the attacks on the World Trade Center, it was believed by some that there was sort of satellite imagery evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. A group of individuals who already believed Iraq to be up to no good believed this evidence to then support that belief, and they all performed this sort of form of groupthink that caused us to actually get engaged in a war where we have now since shown definitively there were no weapons of mass destruction. The same thing just happened very recently, right? A group of individuals all believed the election to be stolen, in large part because a number of powerful individuals said it was, without any evidence at all, without any objective evidence that's been demonstrated. They acted upon that because the group mentality can lead to that overconfidence in that sort of biased decision making. So again, telling you these things not because I have a quick fix for them, but because they are things you must be aware of when you are looking at your data. Another thing to really keep in mind is that when we're looking at research, we're talking a lot about what's likely to happen just normally, even if nothing's going on. So if caffeine has no effect on memory, what would probably happen in my experiment if I had 2 groups out there? One had caffeine, one didn't. I'd probably expect that there'd be no difference whatsoever. Now, when I say no difference whatsoever, let's say I took an average and group A ended up with 75% recall of all of those words. That's averaged across all those people in group A. And then group B that didn't get caffeine, they end up with, let's say 74%. 75 is different from 74, but that's not a very big difference, right? We expect some degree of difference to occur completely randomly. If I did it again, group A might come in at 72%, and group B might come in at 76%. But the point is that they will always be pretty close, because if indeed caffeine has no effect, they are always going to be relatively near in performance. So the idea is, how far would they have to be different for me to say, okay, that's unusual? Because just 3 or 4% seems fine. But what if it was 20% versus 90% performance? Well, that's a huge difference, right? At that point, we might say something unusual is going on. Now we need to look into it. And so because that's the basis of hypothesis testing, the unusual or unexpected event, we need to sort of understand a little bit about probability. And in particular, one thing that humans suffer with is differentiating between what we might call subjective probability, right? My own opinion or judgment about how likely I think something is to occur, versus the expected relative frequency probability, right? Long range probability. It means the expected outcome if the trial were repeated in true form, infinite numbers of times, right? So if I repeated this thing infinitely, what's the actual objective probability? And we could calculate it based on how many times it did or did not occur in all of those various replications. Subjective probability is my belief about how often it occurs. And our subjective probability is unfortunately prone to a number of biases. So let's say I ask you to get out a coin, right? You flip your coin. It lands. And I want you to record whether it's a head or a tail. So we flip, and it heads. We get another heads. We get another heads. We get another heads. We get a tails. We get a heads. We get a tails. We get a heads, and finally another heads. What's the 11th flip going to be? Predict. You take a guess. Is it going to be a heads? Is it going to be a tails? A lot of people in this situation, assuming they believe this coin to be a legitimate, not weighted or two-headed coin, will make the prediction that the next flip is likely, more likely, to be a tails than it is to be a heads. And that's because they look at this string of outcomes. They say, there have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 heads and only 2 tails in 10 flips. But you and I both know that the expected long-range probability of a coin flip is 50%. And so we should really see half heads, half tails in this particular sample. And if that's the case, then I would expect number 11 to be filling in that lower probability section, right? The section that doesn't have enough observations. So I'd expect it to be a tails. This is not logical. That coin does not care whether it was a tails, a heads, or whatever it was in the previous 10 throws. It has, in my advisor's terminology, and I think he stole it from somebody else, no memory. The coin doesn't know whether it was a head previously or that it was heads 10 times in a row. That will not affect the probability of that 11th outcome. The problem is that humans fall prey to this bias. It's something we call the gambler's fallacy. Essentially, it's a type of biased thinking where an individual believes a previous occurrence has an effect on an ensuing occurrence when in fact the two are unrelated, right? So that the previous coin flip and its outcome has any effect on the subsequent coin flip and its outcome.
Hello, sir.
Enough with the foreplay, sailor. What are you selling?
Well, I was going to try to sell you some handsome cream, but I can see you already bought out the store.
Go on.
So perhaps you'd be interested in something every homeowner cannot be without. Volcano insurance.
Go on.
According to my uncle, who's a real whiz with volcanoes, a volcano is coming this way.
I, too, have an uncle. Come in. How much is this volcano insurance?
I don't know. Let's say $200.
$200? That's more than I spent on all that handsome cream. I don't have that kind of money.
What about that jar of money?
Oh, wait, that's Lois's rainy day fund.
Ah, come on. It never rains in Rhode Island?
Well, yeah, but I'm pretty sure we've never had a volcano either.
Well, don't you think we're overdue for one?
Touché, salesman.
Touché, salesman. How did he convince Peter there at the end to buy that volcano insurance? He said, there hasn't been a volcano in a long time in Rhode Island. Don't you think we're due for one? The gambler's fallacy. You've lost 50 times in a row at slots. 50 times in a row at any of those tables that you know to be completely predicted by random occurrence, not skill. But you keep losing. You start to believe that that next outcome of a win is more and more probable. The more losses I have, the more likely it is that a win is on the horizon. That's not how probability works. Those events are entirely independent of one another. The first pull of that slot machine and the second pull of that slot machine are not part of some larger database of that machine trying to make sure that 30% or 2% of the pulls pay out. It's part of a huge algorithm that uses random probability to determine whether or not that particular event fit one of its winning categories. They're all independent, right? But that gambler's fallacy is something we fall prey to, and it's a good example of how human beings frequently do not have a good idea of what random events truly look like. So, what does it mean to look at something that's likely to happen versus not likely to happen? So let's say I asked all of you that have grandmothers that are still alive, okay? Some of you have 2, some of you have 1, some of you might not have any. We count up all the grandmas in the class. We count up all the students that have those grandmas in the class. We count up all the days in a given year. And we say, what's the probability then, at random, that one of your grandmothers would die on a given day of the semester? Okay, so I can count up, let's say there's 180 days in the semester. Let's say there are only 18 grandmas, in our class. Then we can easily calculate the probability that a grandma would die on any given day throughout the semester. What if then, as we go through the semester, and professors frequently do find this in our anecdotal conversations, we compare notes, that oftentimes on examination days, or days in which large papers are due, grandmothers, and more so than grandfathers, die. This, if you compare the absolute probability of what the likelihood would be that a grandma would die on any given day, purely objective based on how many grandmas and how many days there are, this probability is way higher. It's what in inferential statistics we'd say, wow, that does not look like nothing's going on. We can pretty much rule out that it's not the case that nothing is going on. So then what the hell is going on? I don't know, but I'm a little frightened. I've got but one grandma left, and I don't want to lose her. Thankfully, I don't have any exams left over, but you guys do. Hell, you got an exam coming up. So, as a responsible individual, what might I do? One thing I've thought about is just to eliminate exams entirely. Right? Forget it. Hell, it's not worth it. I'd rather we just discuss the statistics stuff, and I'd sort of assess you that way rather than your grandma die. I thought about only allowing orphans to enroll in your classes, but enrollment's an issue at universities, and the registrar's office doesn't allow me to do that. I thought about having you guys lie to your families. If you happen to be getting together with your grandma, which you shouldn't during a pandemic, but if you happen to be getting together with your grandma in a safe way, socially distanced, 6 feet apart, maybe on Zoom, don't tell her you've got an exam coming up. Lie. Say, I'm in classes with no exams this semester, Grandma. You'll be just fine. Just, wear a mask and stay home, okay? That seems to be the only thing I can do. And so obviously this is a little bit of a contrived example. If your grandma dies during this class, please forgive me. Hopefully it didn't happen before an exam. And as I've said before, you can take a makeup exam. Just get me a copy of the death certificate or a smiling selfie with her corpse. And we'll take care of the arrangements. But yeah, absolutely. No, you get the idea, right? We're looking at likely events, unlikely events. If something unlikely is occurring, then we can rule out that nothing is going on. It's definitely not the case that nothing is going on, because look at this really unlikely, low probability event that occurred. Okay? That's the logic of inferential statistics. This last video, I want to sort of talk about some of the variables we've already discussed, and then sort of see how they would play out in a sort of an experimental setup, so we can get an idea of how probability fits in there, what sorts of errors we can make in our conclusions, and then we'll be done, and you guys will be ready to start studying for your first exam. All right? Cheers.
Our minds are divided between an elephant and a rider. And while we often think of the rider as the one in control of the elephant, we often forget that the rider is only the guide. We usually call our rider consciousness and our elephant unconsciousness. and it's the divide between them that makes us think we are right when we are actually wrong. And guess what? It doesn't matter how smart you are or if you're liberal or conservative. You are first and foremost human. This means that you are also biased toward yourself, your beliefs, and your values. Bias is simply when we think in a way that leads us to be wrong. It's unavoidable and hard to recognize. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of bias. But one of the most familiar to us is called confirmation bias. This is when, for example, you see some politician on TV denying that the climate is changing and only legitimizes the facts that support her or his point of view. But why does this happen, and why is it in our nature to see the evidence on only our side of the table? Our brains have to understand a shitload of data, but it can't, so instead it takes shortcuts so that we can focus on what we think are the most important bits. These shortcuts are stored deeply in our unconscious mind and is the reason we create stereotypes. For example, when we grow up, we mostly see men as leaders and women as caretakers. Think about it. Can you name one female US president? How about one actor that is typecast as a stay-at-home dad? Because of these life experiences, our brains create patterns and store them in our elephants or our unconsciousness. These patterns then turn into generalized thoughts and expectations about most things, in this case of men and women. It turns out that in many cases these generalized thoughts are wrong. Women can make pretty great leaders and men can be amazing stay-at-home dads. But even if the writer understands this, it's still hard to control what our elephant believes. This explains a lot about why our brains have these patterns and why they create stereotypes. But what about why we try to prove people wrong even when we are wrong? A theory in evolutionary psychology says we evolved our ability to reason as a way to further our social agendas, justify our actions, and defend the groups we belong to. Why? Groups that work well together often beat groups that are made up of selfish individuals. In a way, we are all self-righteous hypocrites. Our elephants want us to survive so that our group dominates. Part of this means we often find evidence that supports a belief that we already have, rather than looking for the evidence that opposes our already held belief. And everybody is prone to this kind of confirmation bias, this video included. One recent example of confirmation bias is President Trump's nominee to lead the White House Council on Environmental Quality, Kathleen Hartnett-White. Ms. White doesn't believe that human activity is a major driver of climate change and claims that carbon dioxide emissions is good for the environment. On one side, you have millions of people that will immediately call this bitch crazy. But if you ask those disagreeers why, many of them won't be able to share the evidence to disprove her. Instead, they will go with their gut, aka their elephant, which can also be right, by the way. At the same time, if you were to ask that crazy bitch Miss White why she believes CO2 is good for the environment,
satellites already show a greening of the Earth, in part from the very small amount of carbon dioxide involved with using fossil fuels.
she'd probably give you a list of her reasons, but wouldn't address the evidence on the other side of the table. She probably would also leave out the fact that she is a lobbyist for the Texas Public Policy Foundation, an organization founded by arch-conservative Christian billionaire James Leninger. This is an organization that has a mission to deregulate markets and has been funded by ExxonMobil, Chevron, and other companies dubbed the who's who of Texas polluters. She might also leave out the fact that she's a bad person and doesn't really care about how her actions affect others. For example, she voted to build coal plants near Dallas even when the mayors and officials of those areas strongly opposed it. Let's just say that Miss White's elephant is f***ed up. But because of her bias, she as the writer probably doesn't even know that and probably thinks she's doing the right thing. And this is why she, you, and I are all often wrong. We forget that we can be wrong, and it's especially hard for people that have been stereotyped as smart their whole lives to admit that their elephant is in more control of them than they are as the writer. And as an expert, it might be even harder to say, I was wrong, and harder still to say, I don't know. Miss White is an expert, and so are thousands of other scientists and policymakers. But as an expert, politician, teacher, human, or whatever, it's our responsibility to make decisions and judgments that are as bias-free as possible and admit when we are wrong or simply don't know the answer. Unfortunately, those in leadership are often the ones that are least likely to do that. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe, like, and share this video. It all